The man who swore love was nothing more than an expensive illusion had no idea that one ordinary woman was about to become the only exception he could never escape. The crystal chandeliers hanging above the grand Aurora ballroom scattered warm golden light across polished marble floors, reflecting off champagne glasses worth more than most people earned in a week. Manhattan's wealthiest families laughed effortlessly beneath towering floral arrangements, while a string quartet filled every quiet pause with elegant music. At the center of it all stood Nathaniel Pierce, a 36-year-old millionaire whose name appeared on magazine covers almost as often as the stock market itself. His tailored black tuxedo looked flawless, his posture perfectly composed, his expression untouched by excitement or admiration. Women admired him. Investors respected him. Rivals feared him. Yet no one truly knew him. They knew the fortune. They knew the headlines. They knew the carefully crafted public image of the brilliant businessman who built an empire before turning 40. What they never saw was the invisible wall surrounding his heart, a wall so high that not even he remembered how it had been built. "Nathaniel," a graceful blonde woman whispered as she stepped closer, her diamond bracelet catching the light. "You've spent the entire evening avoiding me." He glanced at her with polite indifference. "I wasn't aware I had been assigned seating beside you." Several nearby guests laughed softly, assuming it was another example of his dry humor. The woman forced a smile, refusing to surrender. "People keep wondering why a man like you has never fallen in love." Nathaniel slowly lifted his glass but never took a sip. "People waste too much time wondering about things that don't increase shareholder value." Another ripple of laughter moved across the room, but the woman leaned closer anyway. "Have you ever loved anyone?" she asked quietly. For the first time all evening, the ballroom seemed almost silent. Nathaniel looked directly into her eyes, his face calm enough to make the answer feel colder than winter. "Love is a weakness I cannot afford." The sentence landed with the finality of a locked door. No anger. No cruelty. Just certainty. The woman nodded once, masking disappointment before disappearing into the crowd. Nathaniel returned his attention to the skyline visible beyond the ballroom windows, where thousands of lights stretched across Manhattan like distant stars. To everyone else, it looked as though nothing had happened. But across the room, someone entirely outside his world had unknowingly witnessed every word. Clara Whitmore balanced a silver serving tray against her shoulder, carefully weaving between elegantly dressed guests. At 28, she had worked enough catering events to recognize people who believed money could solve every problem, yet this was her first assignment inside the famous Pierce Foundation Gala. Her black uniform fit neatly, though its sleeves had already begun showing signs of countless laundry cycles. Comfortable shoes mattered more than appearance during 12-hour shifts. She quietly reminded herself to stay focused. Finish tonight. Pick up tomorrow's morning shift. Visit her mother before the hospital's visiting hours ended. Life left very little room for mistakes. As she approached a nearby table carrying sparkling water, a guest abruptly stepped backward without looking. The edge of Clara's tray tilted just enough for one crystal glass to slide. Time seemed to slow. The glass struck the marble floor with a sharp crack, scattering tiny glittering pieces across the polished surface. Conversations paused. Several guests turned simultaneously. Clara's heartbeat pounded inside her ears, but instead of freezing, she immediately knelt, reaching carefully for the broken pieces before anyone could accidentally step on them. "I'm so sorry," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the dozens of eyes now watching her. "Please give me just a moment." A wealthy guest frowned impatiently, brushing invisible dust from his expensive shoes as though the accident had somehow offended him personally. "Some people simply don't belong in rooms like this," he muttered loud enough for others to hear. Clara lowered her eyes only long enough to finish gathering the broken glass. Then she looked up with quiet dignity, offering a sincere smile instead of an excuse. "Everyone deserves the chance to make one honest mistake," she answered softly. Across the ballroom, Nathaniel Pierce found himself looking away from the skyline for the first time that evening, and without understanding why, he could not seem to look away from her. The ballroom slowly returned to its elegant rhythm, But Nathaniel Pierce remained exactly where he was, watching the young server finish collecting every tiny piece of shattered crystal before another guest could step near it. She never rushed. She never argued. She simply thanked a fellow employee who handed her a fresh towel and quietly continued working as though the embarrassment belonged to no one. That unsettled him more than the accident itself. Most people either begged for sympathy or searched desperately for someone else to blame. She had done neither. A few minutes later, the event manager hurried toward Clara with visible concern. "Are you all right?" he whispered. Clara offered a reassuring smile. "I am fine. Nobody was hurt. That is what matters." The manager exhaled with relief before sending her toward the service corridor to replace the broken glassware. Nathaniel watched her disappear behind the double doors, then surprised himself by asking his executive assistant a question that had nothing to do with quarterly reports or acquisitions. "Who is she?" Olivia followed his gaze before answering. "Temporary catering staff. They rotate every gala. I can ask if there is a problem." Nathaniel hesitated for half a second. "There is no problem." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "Then why do you want her name?" He looked back toward the ballroom windows. "Curiosity is not a crime." Olivia knew him well enough to understand that curiosity was something Nathaniel almost never admitted. 5 minutes later she returned with a small tablet. "Her name is Clara Whitmore. 20 years old. Works for Hudson Premier Catering. She usually takes double shifts." Nathaniel accepted the information with a brief nod, pretending it meant nothing. Yet the name quietly settled somewhere in his memory. Clara Whitmore. Meanwhile, behind the ballroom, Clara washed the remaining glasses with practiced movements. Another server laughed gently. "You almost became tonight's biggest headline." Clara smiled while drying a wine glass. "Thankfully, glasses are easier to replace than people. Most guests would have screamed at you." "Maybe," Clara replied. "But carrying anger is heavier than carrying a tray." The older dishwasher chuckled. "Your mother taught you that?" Clara's smile softened. "She teaches me something every single day." Her phone vibrated inside her apron pocket. During a short break she stepped outside the service entrance, where cool autumn air replaced the warmth of the ballroom. The city lights stretched endlessly across Midtown as she answered the call. "Hi, Mom." Her voice immediately became lighter. "Yes, the gala is going well." "No, I already ate." "Please stop worrying." A gentle voice answered through the speaker. "You always say that, sweetheart." Clara laughed quietly. "Because it is true enough." They talked only a few minutes about hospital therapy, tomorrow's doctor appointment, and whether Clara was sleeping enough. She promised she would visit first thing in the morning before hanging up. For a brief moment she leaned against the brick wall and closed her eyes, allowing herself one deep breath before returning to work. Unknown to her, a limousine had just pulled up near the private entrance. Nathaniel stepped outside to escape another meaningless conversation with investors and paused when he heard the last few words of Clara's phone call. "I love you too, Mom. I will see you tomorrow." The sentence lingered in the quiet night long after the call ended. She slipped her phone away, straightened her uniform, and walked back inside without realizing she had left behind something almost invisible. Resting on a nearby bench was a neatly folded white handkerchief embroidered with the initials N.P., the one Nathaniel had absent-mindedly offered earlier when she had reached for the broken glass. Clara had carefully washed away the tiny stain, pressed every crease flat, and folded it with remarkable care. Nathaniel picked it up slowly, running his fingers across the perfectly clean fabric. For reasons he could not explain, the expensive linen no longer felt like his handkerchief. It felt like the first unanswered question someone had placed inside his carefully ordered world. The gala ended just before midnight, but Nathaniel Pierce found himself carrying the neatly folded white handkerchief all the way home instead of leaving it with his assistant. His penthouse overlooking Central Park was exactly as it had always been, perfectly organized, perfectly quiet, and perfectly empty. The city sparkled beneath enormous windows, yet the silence felt louder than the traffic dozens of stories below. He loosened his tie, placed his watch on the marble counter, then stopped as his eyes drifted toward the handkerchief resting in his palm. Every expensive possession in his home had been selected by designers. Every painting had been purchased through advisors. Every piece of furniture had a price attached to it. Yet somehow the simplest object in the room now held his attention the longest. He remembered the way Clara Whitmore had returned it without being asked. She had washed away the stain. She had folded every corner with care. She could have thrown it away. She could have kept it. Instead, she had quietly respected something that did not belong to her. Nathaniel shook his head as though dismissing an irrational thought, but the image refused to disappear. The next morning began exactly the way every morning had for years. At 6 o'clock he completed his workout, answered international calls, reviewed market reports, and entered Pierce Global Headquarters before 8. Employees greeted him with nervous professionalism as he crossed the polished lobby, his reputation always arriving a few steps before he did. During the executive meeting, department heads presented revenue forecasts, acquisition opportunities, and expansion strategies. Nathaniel listened with complete focus until Olivia paused halfway through a presentation. "There is also the hospitality partnership renewal for next month's charity events," she said while changing the screen. "The catering companies are requesting confirmation." Nathaniel glanced briefly at the company logos before speaking. "Keep Hudson Premier Catering." Several executives exchanged confused looks. Another firm had submitted a lower bid. "May I ask why?" Olivia questioned carefully. Nathaniel answered without hesitation. "Consistency has value." No one argued, but Olivia quietly recognized that this was the first time Nathaniel had personally involved himself in selecting a catering contractor. Across the city, Clara Whitmore sat beside her mother in a bright hospital room where morning sunlight filtered gently through the curtains. Her mother smiled warmly despite the fatigue visible around her eyes. "You look tired," she said softly. Clara laughed while peeling an orange into neat slices. "That is because rich people celebrate very late." Her mother smiled. "Did anyone at least appreciate your hard work?" Clara thought for a moment before shrugging. "Most people were too busy looking at themselves." Then she remembered one pair of calm gray eyes watching from across the ballroom. Although one man seemed different. Her mother tilted her head with quiet curiosity. "Different how?" Clara smiled to herself before placing another orange slice onto the small plate. "I cannot explain it. He looked lonely even when surrounded by hundreds of people." Her mother reached across the blanket and gently squeezed Clara's hand. "Sometimes the loneliest people are the ones everyone believes have everything." Those words stayed with Clara long after she kissed her mother goodbye and headed toward her afternoon shift. Neither woman knew that only a few miles away, Nathaniel Pierce was standing inside his corner office, absent-mindedly opening the top drawer of his desk just to look once more at a perfectly folded white handkerchief that had somehow become the first object capable of interrupting the carefully controlled rhythm of his life. 3 days later, another Pierce Foundation event transformed the rooftop restaurant of the company's flagship hotel into a sea of polished elegance overlooking the Hudson River. Nathaniel Pierce rarely noticed the details of these gatherings anymore. Every speech sounded familiar. Every handshake felt rehearsed. Every compliment carried an invisible expectation. Yet before he even entered the dining room, he heard himself asking Olivia a question that surprised them both. "Is Hudson Premier Catering handling tonight's event?" Olivia looked up from her tablet with a knowing expression she wisely chose not to reveal. "Yes. They arrived an hour ago." Nathaniel answered with nothing more than a quiet nod, but as he walked inside, his eyes searched the room before anyone had the opportunity to greet him. Near the far end of the terrace, Clara Whitmore adjusted a centerpiece that had shifted slightly in the afternoon breeze. She never noticed him. Instead, she smiled warmly while helping an older employee carry a heavy serving tray to the kitchen entrance. "You should let me take that," Clara said gently. "Your shoulder was bothering you yesterday." The woman laughed. "You already worked the breakfast shift." "Then I have had more practice," Clara replied with a playful smile before lifting the tray herself. Nathaniel remained completely still. It was such a small moment that everyone else ignored it, yet he found himself watching until the tray disappeared behind the kitchen doors. There had been no audience, no applause, and no possibility of earning favor from anyone important. She had simply helped because someone needed help. The realization unsettled him in ways another billion-dollar negotiation never could. During dinner, one of the hotel's senior managers approached Clara with visible frustration. "Table 12 requested a special dessert that is not on tonight's menu." Clara glanced toward the guests before answering calmly. "Let me check the kitchen. Maybe we already have the ingredients." "We do not," the manager sighed. "Then I will see what can be prepared without delaying everyone else." 20 minutes later, a simple plate of fresh berries, honey, and warm pastry arrived at the table. The elderly woman who had requested it smiled with genuine delight. "This reminds me of breakfasts my husband used to make." Clara smiled back. Sometimes the simplest things become the most memorable. Nathaniel overheard every word. The dessert had probably cost less than $15, yet the gratitude on the woman's face seemed worth far more than anything listed on the evening's financial reports. Later that night, as guests gradually departed, Nathaniel walked through a quiet service hallway on his way to a private elevator. Halfway down the corridor he stopped. Clara sat alone on a small folding chair beside the employee lockers, holding a paper cup of tea between both hands. She looked exhausted, her shoulders finally relaxing after nearly 14 hours on her feet. She quietly removed a folded photograph from her apron pocket. It showed her standing beside her mother outside the hospital several years earlier, both laughing beneath bright spring sunshine. Clara smiled softly at the picture before slipping it back into her pocket and finishing the last sip of tea. She had no idea anyone had seen the moment. Nathaniel turned away before she could notice him, but for the rest of the evening the image refused to leave his mind. In boardrooms he had learned to evaluate companies within minutes. In politics he had learned to read ambition with remarkable accuracy. Yet the woman carrying serving trays continued to present a mystery he could not solve, because everything she did when no one was watching seemed even more genuine than when the room was full. The following Monday, Nathaniel Pierce surprised his entire executive team by canceling a lunch with 2 international investors, something he had not done in years. The official explanation was that he wanted to inspect hospitality operations before the company's annual expansion. No one questioned the decision, although Olivia quietly noticed that the inspection happened to coincide with another event managed by Hudson Premier Catering. By early afternoon, Nathaniel walked through the luxury hotel's marble lobby with several department heads following behind him. Managers eagerly pointed out renovated suites, redesigned conference rooms, and improved guest services, expecting detailed questions about occupancy rates and revenue projections. Instead, Nathaniel found himself noticing something entirely different. Clara Whitmore stood near the reception desk helping a nervous new employee who had accidentally entered the wrong reservation into the system. The young woman looked close to tears. "I am going to lose this job," she whispered. Clara gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Take one slow breath. We can still fix this before the guests arrive. But everyone will think I am incompetent." Clara smiled warmly. "Everyone starts somewhere. The only real mistake is refusing to learn." Together they corrected the reservation within minutes, and the relieved employee thanked Clara repeatedly before hurrying away with renewed confidence. Nathaniel continued walking, but Clara's words echoed in his thoughts. Everyone starts somewhere. The sentence sounded impossibly simple, yet strangely powerful. Later that afternoon, a sudden rainstorm swept across Manhattan, darkening the hotel windows and forcing several outdoor deliveries to be moved inside. Staff members rushed through the service entrance carrying flowers, linens, and food supplies before the weather worsened. Clara immediately joined them without waiting for instructions, lifting boxes nearly as large as herself while laughing with coworkers despite the pouring rain. Her uniform sleeves became damp, and loose strands of blonde hair escaped from her ponytail, yet she never complained. Nathaniel watched from the covered entrance as employees naturally gathered around her, not because she held authority, but because her calm presence somehow made difficult moments feel manageable. One of the hotel supervisors approached Nathaniel. "She is technically temporary staff, but everyone asks for her whenever we have large events. Guests remember her. Employees trust her." Nathaniel looked toward Clara again. "Does she know who owns this hotel?" The supervisor smiled. "I doubt she thinks about that. She treats everyone exactly the same." Those words lingered far longer than the conversation itself. A few minutes later, as the rain finally slowed, Clara carried a cardboard box toward the employee parking lot. The bottom suddenly softened from the moisture, and several neatly wrapped bakery boxes slipped onto the pavement. Before anyone else reacted, Nathaniel stepped forward and caught two of them before they touched the ground. Clara looked up in surprise, recognizing him instantly from the gala. "Thank you," she said with genuine appreciation. "These are for the children's wing at St. Matthew Medical Center. I would hate to arrive with crushed desserts." Nathaniel handed the boxes back carefully. "You volunteer there?" Clara nodded. "My mother receives treatment there, so whenever the bakery donates extra pastries, I bring them to the waiting families. Hospital days feel a little shorter when someone remembers dessert." She smiled politely, thanked him once again, and continued toward her car without asking who he was or expecting the conversation to continue. Nathaniel remained standing beneath the gray afternoon sky, watching her drive away in an aging sedan that had clearly seen better years. For reasons he could neither justify nor explain, the board meeting waiting upstairs suddenly seemed far less important than the woman who had just thanked him with the same quiet sincerity she offered everyone else, whether they wore a designer suit or a catering uniform. Over the next 2 weeks, Nathaniel Pierce quietly changed habits that had defined his life for more than a decade, although no one inside Pierce Global understood why. Meetings that once lasted until late evenings suddenly ended on time whenever he knew the hotel was hosting another foundation event. Site inspections became unexpectedly frequent. Charity projects that he had previously approved with a signature now received his personal attention. Olivia noticed the pattern long before anyone else did, but she respected his silence. One rainy Thursday evening, Nathaniel arrived at the hotel just as another event was ending. Guests drifted toward waiting cars while employees hurried to restore the ballroom before the next morning. He intended to leave after a brief conversation with the general manager, but a familiar laugh echoed from the service corridor. Almost without thinking, he followed the sound. Clara Whitmore stood beside two exhausted coworkers sharing a small box of leftover cookies that had not been served during the reception. She broke the final cookie into 3 equal pieces before handing the largest one to the oldest employee. "You worked harder than both of us today," she said with a smile. "That is not true," the woman protested. Clara laughed softly. "Then humor me." Nathaniel remained around the corner, unseen, surprised that someone with so little always seemed ready to give away the best portion. A few minutes later the hallway emptied, leaving only Clara carrying a stack of folded table linens toward the employee elevator. At the exact moment the elevator doors opened, the building lights flickered once before switching to emergency power for several seconds because of the severe storm outside. The sudden darkness froze Nathaniel where he stood. His breathing became uneven. A memory he had buried years earlier rushed back without warning. He was 17 again, trapped inside a stalled elevator after a downtown blackout, listening helplessly as his frightened younger sister cried beside him for nearly an hour. She had survived that day, but the helplessness had never completely disappeared from his mind. Even after the lights returned, his chest tightened. His heartbeat accelerated. He instinctively stepped backward into the quiet corridor, trying to hide the moment from anyone nearby. Clara noticed him almost immediately. She did not ask unnecessary questions. She simply walked over carrying 2 paper cups of hot tea she had picked up for the staff. "The storm startled everyone," she said gently, offering him one of the cups without mentioning the tremor in his hands. Nathaniel hesitated before accepting it. "I am fine." Clara smiled with quiet understanding. "Sometimes being fine takes a minute." Either of them spoke for several moments. Rain tapped softly against the nearby windows while the building settled back into its normal rhythm. Nathaniel stared into the rising steam from the tea. Do you always assume strangers need help? Clara shook her head. No. I just try to notice when someone does. He looked at her, genuinely puzzled. Most people would pretend they saw nothing, she answered calmly. Pretending never makes anyone feel less alone. The simple sentence settled deep inside him. For the first time in years, Nathaniel did not feel like a millionaire speaking with an employee. He felt like a tired man sitting beside someone who expected nothing from him except honesty. When the elevator finally reopened, Clara stood and gathered her linens. You should finish your tea before going back outside, she said warmly. It is colder than it looks. She walked away without waiting for gratitude, leaving Nathaniel alone with a paper cup that cost less than $2 yet somehow brought him more comfort than anything inside his penthouse had managed in years. As he watched the elevator doors close behind her, he realized something that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier. He had spent his entire life believing people became unforgettable because of power, beauty, or wealth. Clara Whitmore was becoming unforgettable simply because she always knew how to make another human being feel seen. The following week, invitations arrived for the Pierce Foundation's largest annual charity gala, an evening where business leaders, donors, and national media gathered beneath one roof. Nathaniel Pierce approved every detail with unusual precision, although his attention drifted toward a single question he refused to ask aloud. Would Clara be working that night? The answer came the moment he entered the ballroom. She stood near the entrance welcoming guests with the same quiet warmth she offered everyone else, whether they carried $1 million donation check or simply delivered flowers. For an instant their eyes met. Clara smiled politely, exactly as she would have smiled at any other guest, and Nathaniel felt an unexpected disappointment that he could not explain. Before he could speak with her, another familiar voice interrupted the evening. Nathaniel. Vanessa Hale stepped into the ballroom wearing an elegant emerald gown that immediately drew the attention of nearby photographers. She had once been the woman everyone assumed would become Mrs. Pierce, until their engagement ended years earlier under circumstances Nathaniel rarely discussed. Vanessa smiled with flawless confidence, as though no time had passed at all. It has been too long, she said softly. Nathaniel answered with professional courtesy. Good evening, Vanessa. From across the room, Clara noticed nothing unusual beyond another well-dressed guest greeting the Foundation's chairman. She continued serving tables, unaware that several members of New York's social circle had already begun whispering. Vanessa quickly noticed Nathaniel's attention wandering beyond their conversation. Following his gaze, she saw Clara carrying a tray of sparkling water toward a nearby table. A subtle smile crossed Vanessa's face, not from kindness but from calculation. Interesting, she murmured. You are watching the catering staff now? Nathaniel looked back at her. I watch people who work hard. Vanessa laughed lightly. That sounds dangerously sentimental coming from you. Later that evening, while Clara organized dessert plates in the service area, Vanessa quietly approached the hotel manager. Would you be so kind as to ask Miss Whitmore to bring a private bottle of wine to the chairman's lounge? The request sounded harmless enough, and within minutes Clara carried the unopened bottle upstairs. She knocked gently before entering. Nathaniel looked up from reviewing donation reports, clearly surprised to see her instead of hotel staff. I was asked to bring this, Clara explained, placing the bottle on the table. Before Nathaniel could answer, the lounge door opened again. Vanessa entered with perfectly timed confidence, and stopped dramatically after noticing Clara standing beside him. Oh, she said with a pleasant smile that never reached her eyes. I hope I am not interrupting. Clara immediately stepped back. Not at all. I was just leaving. Vanessa waited until the door closed before turning toward Nathaniel. People notice things, she said casually. Especially when powerful men begin showing unusual interest in beautiful employees. Nathaniel's expression hardened. Be careful with your assumptions. Vanessa only smiled. I am not the one making assumptions. I am warning you how quickly stories spread. Downstairs, Clara returned to work without realizing she had just become the subject of quiet speculation. Two unfamiliar guests glanced toward her before whispering behind raised glasses. Another woman smiled politely while asking a friend, "Is she the one everyone keeps talking about?" Clara simply assumed they were discussing the evening's charity auction. She had no idea that a carefully planted rumor had already begun moving through the ballroom, growing a little larger with every conversation, while Nathaniel stood upstairs staring out at the Manhattan skyline, sensing for the first time that someone was trying to turn the one genuine connection he had found into another reason to distrust his own heart. By the end of the gala, the whispers had become impossible to ignore. Clara Whitmore noticed conversations ending whenever she approached a table. Guests who had smiled warmly only an hour earlier now exchanged curious glances before looking away. She could not understand what had changed. As the final auction concluded and the ballroom slowly emptied, she carried a tray of coffee cups toward the service station when the hotel manager hurried over with an uneasy expression. "Clara, would you come with me for a moment?" She followed him into a small conference room where Vanessa Hale stood beside two members of the event committee. Vanessa folded her arms gracefully. "This will not take long," she said. "A concern has been raised." Clara looked from one face to another. "What kind of concern?" Vanessa sighed as though disappointed by the entire situation. "Several people noticed that you have received unusual attention from Mr. Pierce during recent events. Naturally, questions have been asked." Clara blinked in confusion. "He has only spoken to me a handful of times." Vanessa tilted her head sympathetically. "Perhaps. But appearances matter. People are beginning to wonder whether your position here has become advantageous." The implication landed like a sudden chill. Clara's face remained calm, but the hurt behind her eyes became impossible to hide. "I have never asked Mr. Pierce for anything," she answered quietly. "Nor would I." Before anyone could respond, the conference room door opened. Nathaniel Pierce stepped inside after learning that Clara had been unexpectedly pulled away from the event floor. His eyes immediately settled on Clara before turning toward Vanessa. "What is happening?" Vanessa answered first. "Only protecting your reputation." Nathaniel looked at Clara. "Did someone accuse you of misconduct?" Clara hesitated for only a second before speaking honestly. "No one accused me directly. They only suggested that people might misunderstand why you have spoken with me." Silence filled the room. Nathaniel remembered every betrayal that had shaped his past. Every relationship that had quietly carried hidden expectations. Every smile that eventually revealed an agenda. For one painful moment, old fears clouded his judgment. He looked at Clara and asked the one question he would regret the instant it left his mouth. "Is there anything you have not told me?" Clara stared at him, disbelief slowly replacing the warmth that had always lived in her expression. She had never expected him to defend her blindly, but she had never imagined he would question her honesty. She reached into her apron pocket and removed a sealed envelope. "The hotel accounting office asked me to sign for a hardship assistance grant yesterday," she explained softly. "After learning it came from the Pierce Foundation, I returned it unopened this afternoon because I did not want anyone believing I accepted special treatment." She placed the envelope gently on the conference table. The official seal had never been broken. Nathaniel looked down at it without speaking. Clara met his eyes one final time. "Kindness should never create debt," she said quietly. "And dignity should never depend on rumors." With that, she removed her employee name badge, placed it beside the envelope, thanked the hotel manager for every opportunity he had given her, and walked out of the room with steady steps. She did not cry. She did not defend herself further. She simply chose to leave with the one thing no rumor could take from her, her self-respect. Nathaniel remained frozen where he stood, staring at the untouched envelope, while Vanessa's carefully crafted smile faded almost imperceptibly. For the first time in many years, he realized that the greatest mistake of his life had not been trusting the wrong person in the past. It had been allowing that old wound to make him doubt the one person who had never asked him for anything at all. Nathaniel Pierce did not sleep that night. The unopened envelope remained on his desk beside the perfectly folded white handkerchief Clara Whitmore had once returned with such quiet care. For hours he stared at both objects until the truth became impossible to ignore. Neither represented money. Both represented character. One had been returned because she refused to accept favors she had not earned. The other had been cleaned because she respected something that belonged to another person. Everything Clara had ever done pointed toward integrity, yet he had allowed one careless question to place doubt where trust should have been. Before sunrise, Nathaniel instructed Olivia to begin a complete review of every security recording and communication related to the gala. By late afternoon, the evidence was undeniable. Video footage clearly showed Vanessa Hale arranging Clara's private meeting in the chairman's lounge. Internal messages confirmed that several anonymous rumors had originated from accounts connected to Vanessa's public relations consultant. Even the so-called concerns raised by guests had been carefully encouraged before the evening had ended. Olivia quietly placed the investigation file on Nathaniel's desk. "She planned the entire situation," she said. Nathaniel closed the folder slowly. "And Clara walked away without defending herself because she believed dignity speaks louder than arguments." 2 days later, the Pierce Foundation hosted a press conference originally scheduled to announce a new community investment program. Journalists, executives, donors, and hotel employees filled the auditorium expecting another routine corporate presentation. Instead, Nathaniel stepped to the podium with no prepared speech in his hands. His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable conviction. "Today I owe someone an apology. Not in private, but in public, because the doubt placed upon her was also public." The room fell completely silent. Nathaniel continued, "After reviewing verified evidence, it is clear that false rumors were intentionally created about Miss Clara Whitmore. She never accepted special treatment, never requested financial assistance, and never used my position for personal gain. In fact, she returned foundation support unopened because she believed self-respect could not be purchased. I failed to recognize that truth when it mattered most, and that failure belongs entirely to me." Cameras flashed across the room. Nathaniel did not look away. "Effective immediately, the Pierce Foundation will establish the Clara Whitmore Hospitality Scholarship, supporting hardworking service employees who demonstrate exceptional integrity and compassion. Character deserves recognition long before wealth does." Later that afternoon, Nathaniel drove alone to St. Matthew Medical Center carrying only a small wooden box. He found Clara sitting beside her mother's window, reading softly while afternoon sunlight warmed the quiet room. She looked surprised to see him but remained composed. Nathaniel placed the box gently on the nearby table. Inside rested the white handkerchief, carefully framed beneath glass. Beneath it were engraved the words, "The first person who reminded me that kindness asks for nothing in return." Clara looked at the keepsake before meeting his eyes. "You did not have to do all of this," she said softly. Nathaniel shook his head. "I did. Because I spent years believing strength meant never trusting anyone. Then I met someone who never asked for my money, my influence, or my name. She only treated me like another human being." Clara remained quiet for several moments before smiling gently. "Trust grows slowly after it is broken." Nathaniel nodded without hesitation. "Then I will be patient." Months passed. He never pressured her, never tried to impress her with expensive gifts, and never asked for another chance through promises alone. Instead, he visited the hospital with books for patients, volunteered quietly beside Foundation staff, and allowed his actions to speak where words once had failed. One crisp autumn afternoon, Clara met him in Central Park beneath trees painted gold and crimson. She looked at the familiar white handkerchief he now carried in his coat pocket instead of locking it away inside a drawer. "You finally learned something," she said with a warm smile. Nathaniel smiled back, a smile softer than any the business world had ever seen. "You taught me that the richest life is not measured by what we own. It is measured by the people we choose to honor every single day." As they walked together beneath the falling leaves, either noticed the skyline rising beyond the trees. For the first time, it no longer mattered which of them came from wealth, and which of them came from hardship, because the strongest foundation either of them had ever built was not made of steel, glass, or fortune. It was built from trust, kindness, forgiveness, and a love that had finally found a heart willing to receive it.